Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
Thank you very much for coming. I think the way that we'll work this format, it's a pretty informal session here, is I'll talk a little bit about the topic here, bears, humans, and habituation. I'd like to acknowledge a host of scientists that are my colleagues that wrote a paper about this topic. So I'll be bringing in some of their research as well as mine when I give this talk, and then Dr. Whitman and I can take a Q&A. We can talk about aspects of the film as well as what I talk about here. Okay. So, just as a general overview, I'm going to talk about areas where we need to control those animals, and it's not necessarily via a harvest sort of management plan. We also try to conserve populations, especially small populations, right? So certain bear populations in the world, along with other wildlife that are maybe rare and elusive, we need to increase their densities, right? These are our conservation sorts of practices, right? That we implement to try to increase the numbers on the landscape. We often have a sustained yield. So hunted populations, our population here in Maine, right? We try to maintain a sustained yield. So we aim for a compensatory harvest. We want to remove individuals from the population that would normally be removed due to just because of nature. Animals die, right? So we want to remove those individuals instead of having an additive mortality where we end up killing more individuals in the population. Okay? And finally, oftentimes in parks, places that are protected, we have these human bear management programs. Oftentimes there's areas within these parks we consider sacrificial areas, and they're areas where we have high densities of people and wildlife, and they often come in contact, and those are our sites where there's typically high human-wildlife conflict. Okay? So in those areas we need to create sustainable solutions for the coexistence of, in this case, people and bears. So we need to both provide viewing opportunities for people and minimize bear incidents, because oftentimes bear incidents leads to bear mortality. Okay? So, a couple of terms just to throw, this is a mess, right? Well, I'm going to try to clear it up for you. Okay, let's start at the top, human-bear interactions. A human-bear interaction is an occurrence when a person and bear are mutually aware of each other. Simple, right? Both parties know that they're there, okay? Another term is overt reaction distance. This is the distance in which a bear responds to another bear, right, in a recognizable way, or to a human, okay? So knowing that, we can address the difference between a bear viewing or a sighting opportunity and a bear incident, okay? So a bear sighting is typically involves a non-human bear interaction, where a bear was maybe unaware of the person, or a human bear interaction where the bear doesn't exhibit any stress-related behavior. Okay, there's nothing noticeable that the bear does. This typically we would categorize as a sighting. Okay, can we think about how that would work? With human-bear interaction, so now when we have mutual awareness, lots of different things can happen. Bears can exhibit stress-related behavior. Bears can exhibit curious behavior. Either way, these are things that we can observe, okay? A person takes evasive action. As a result, we consider that a human-bear conflict. Or when a bear makes physical contact with somebody, for whatever reason it might be, right? Or bears are intentionally killed by people for one reason or another. Typically not human-wildlife management actions. These are all considered human-bear conflict. These things can be both dependent or independent of the following. Bears getting into people's human food, right? Damaging their property, hurting their pets, or even getting killed by cars, okay? So all of these things we group as incidents versus these things over here that are bear sightings, okay? So bear incidents are particularly important because, again, they oftentimes lead to management actions that lead to bear mortality, okay? Sightings are really nice because they provide an opportunity where we can talk to the public about bear behavior. We can talk about why we don't want to habituate these animals, okay? The reasons why I'm going to talk about in a second. But this is a great opportunity to go and talk to the people. We usually have very high densities of bears. So we have very high densities of bears in these areas. They have very short overt reaction distances. They're very tolerant of each other because usually there's a major food source like a salmon stream, right? McNeil River Falls, right? Brooks Falls. These places, there's abundant food. The bears can be social, when typically they're a very asocial animal, except a small window in their life, okay? So habituation generally refers to loss of avoidance and escape responses, okay? Bear to bear sort of habituation is typically facilitated by bear density. The more density that you have, okay, typically you have a lot of interaction among individuals, but those interactions are typically fairly benign, okay? Where bears have to worry is when density is a little lower, right? When they're potentially competing for resources rather than in an area where there's a surplus of resources, okay? Bear human habituation is when bears adapt to the harmless presence of people, okay? Now, you can imagine this kind of thing could potentially lead to some problems, right? Bear-to-bear habituation typically isn't a problem for us. It's an opportunity for us, okay? But these, now we've got some issues, as well as human to bears. So oftentimes when we have high bear-to-human habituation, we then will have people becoming habituated to bears. So people getting closer to bears, right? Not just bears getting closer to people, okay? And what we find, actually, when we look at the data, especially in Alaska, is that the more animals that you have on the landscape per unit effort, in this case 1,000 square kilometers, right, the less problems you're going to have with people. So the higher the densities, which is due to a number of factors, usually an abundance of natural food, okay? Not always natural food, but some kind of food resource on the landscape, you can typically have less problems with people, okay? So these are the kinds of things that we need to go and manage because they actually can go very wrong too. And when they go really wrong, so why are we safer? Well, surprise encounters are lower, right? Not only for people, but for bears. And also, habituation reduces any kind of food defending behavior that the animal might have, okay? So, the reason we worry about habituated animals and habituated people is we really don't want this sort of thing to happen. We don't want an animal now to associate human food with people, right? Now that association can lead to problems. You can have bears ripping off backpacks of people, breaking into their cars while they're in them, breaking into their homes, okay? Those kinds of problems, typically, they can lead to problems with people. People can get hurt. But the reality is, at the end of the day, it's usually the animal that gets reduced from the population, right? Not the people, okay? So if we want to protect the bears, we want to protect the people, we need to reduce the probability of this happening, okay? So we need to remove those human foods on the landscapes that can be associated with people, okay? Just as a general sort of in this Venn diagram, we see that we've got this large circle that represents habituated animals, okay? The two groups that we were discussing. We've got these habituated animals, And then within there, we have these habituated food conditioned animals. This is what we really want to prevent. We want to prevent that from happening. So we set up our management programs often in a proactive sort of way. Proactive, what I mean is that we try to keep bears from eating human food in the first place. Okay, and being able to associate that human food with people. Okay? So instead of just dealing with problem animals, which is more reactive management, we already have this problem with this animal, and we're going to either reduce it from the population, we're going to move it somewhere else, right? Or we're going to maybe use aversive conditioning sort of techniques to try to behaviorally modify that animal for the long term. Okay? That sort of thing, those are the sort of tactics that we use on the individual. But to reduce this, we typically need to do it in a proactive way. We need to remove those human foods on the landscape so that they don't have access to them in the first place, right? Using food storage receptacles, whether it's in the backcountry or front country. We educate, right? We talk to people. We try to change the value system, right? Right? We have law enforcement involved, where people who do violate, they get punished and are examples for the rest of us. Those kinds of things, those are proactive measures to reduce the problem at the population level. Okay? Sometimes we have food conditioned animals that aren't involved. So these are animals that actually seek out human foods, but they don't associate necessarily those human foods with people. If we think of our bear baiting program in Maine for hunters, is a perfect example. There might not necessarily, there could be, but there might not necessarily be an association with people when animals visit those bait piles. The health issue of feeding animals anthropogenic foods high in sugars, right, is a whole nother problem, right? But as far as food conditioning goes, human food conditioning goes, there are cases, like here in Maine, where animals aren't necessarily habituated. Okay? And this is a problem too, because what we found in our research is that when animals become food conditioned, they can pass this information on to their offspring. Okay? So we need to be very diligent about the kinds of animals that we manage. Females, perhaps, might be more important to keep from getting at human food than males for this very reason. Okay? So, when you watch this film, think about what forms of habituation you can identify that are going on. Okay? Do you think that our main character is helping to protect bears using the strategy that he's using, which is by living with them and being intimate with them as a bear? And then ask yourself, what can you do to protect bears if you care about bears? I assume we all care about bears. That's why we're here, right? What can you do? Okay. With that said, why don't we take some questions? And I do want to invite my colleague up.